Hello and welcome to another episode of Light Up the Darkness podcast. I'm your host, Erin Edwards. In today's episode, we'll be tackling the topic of grief again, but from the perspective of an end-of-life guide. Today's guest is Naomi, and it was such an amazing conversation. I'll just let you listen to it. But I will preface it by saying, when I first met her, she asked me, "How's your heart today?" And that told me everything I needed to know about her. Enjoy the episode, guys. Welcome to Light Up the Darkness podcast. Today's guest is Naomi. She's an end-of-life doula, grief guide, and breath worker. She also hosts a monthly virtual workshop called Black Folks Grieve, an intimate online space held over Zoom for the discussion of grief, death, loss, and everything in between. Welcome, Naomi.
Hi, thank you for having me today.
Thank you for being with me. I'm excited to get into this conversation with you. But first, can we start out by you introducing yourself to listeners?
Sure. My name is Naomi. I am a Black Queer Femme. My pronouns are she, her. I am based in Brooklyn, New York. I am a lifelong New Yorker and born and bred Brooklynite, and I show up in the world through death care and grief work and breath work, and really just wanting to facilitate safer spaces for conversations around grief and loss.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. So today's conversation is again about grief and loss, and what better person to speak to than someone who works in grief care. So can you tell us a little bit about what led you to grief care and where you are today with that?
Definitely. So I would say what led me to grief care as I practice it currently would be the death of my grandmother, Naomi Edmondson, in December of 2019. She was very much and still very much is my mother for all intents and purposes of that word. I feel like all of the things that we go through with our mothers are what I went through with her. So when she died in 2019, it was very sudden, and my just entire world kind of shifted off of its axis. As somebody who grew up with an older parent, I feel like you definitely have those moments of reckoning with the mortality of like one day they're not going to be here. But when that day came, it just completely took me by surprise. So that is kind of what led me into grief care. I just started reading all I could about like what grief was and what this process was, and trying to find spaces and other people that I could talk to and be in community with. Which kind of led me to where I am now, which is just facilitating spaces to talk about grief, and also just like really getting to what this thing we call grief is and what the experience is of it.
Yeah. So when we talk about grief care, what is that exactly? If you could give like a little breakdown of what your work looks like.
Sure. I would say that grief care for me has a lot to do with educating around grief and sort of grief literacy. It has to do with giving people the resources to understand that. I feel like when we talk about grief culturally, we talk about this experience of like someone dies and you feel sad, and then 6 months later, you're not sad anymore, or you're not supposed to be sad anymore. When really what it is that one, we can feel grief over non-death related losses. We can feel grief over our pets dying, or like housing insecurity or job insecurity, or losing chosen family due to coming out as being like queer, LGBTQ plus. Like there are so many ways to experience grief that actually don't have to do with death at all. And it also has to do with educating people around the fact that grief is a bodily experience. Our bodies process grief as a traumatic experience, which means that like when we're grieving, we have those bodily experiences of feeling like disoriented, with brain fog, our bodies are tired, we're fatigued, we forget things.
Mm-hmm.
It is so much more than just this idea of like feeling sad, even though sadness is a part of the experience. So a lot of my work has to do with just providing spaces to educate around that, and also providing events that allow people to sort of tap into their grief and find ways to talk about it in community, because grief can be such an isolating experience that being with other people who maybe aren't experiencing grief exactly the way that you are, but are
Mm-hmm.
still experiencing a form of it, it's just a really nice way to remember that we are not alone in this experience, nor should we be.
Great. And so you also are a death doula or end of life guide,
Mhm.
whichever term is more appropriate, you let me know.
I really
Um,
enjoy end of life guide, but I know that
okay.
people also call themselves death doulas, but I prefer end of life guide.
Okay. End of life guide.
Mhm.
And you are certified, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And how long have you been doing that?
I was certified through a Lua Arthur's Going with Grace program back in 2019.
Hmm.
So I've been doing certified since then. And I would also like to mention that I think that certifications are a really great way to find grounding in doing work like this.
Mm.
But I also don't want to cancel out the fact that Black, Indigenous, like Black and Brown, like people of color have been doing this work along with queer communities. Like we have been doing
Hmm.
this work since time immemorial. Like we have
Hmm.
always taken care of each other and always taken care of our dead. So even though we have certifications, which are helpful, it still should not cancel out like all of the ancestral Indigenous knowledge that we have of this kind of care work.
Yes, totally.
Mm-hmm.
So being an end of life guide, what are some of your practices with the families that you've worked with?
So I guess just to sort of provide a definition is an end of life guide is a non medical person who assists the needs of the dying and their families, or their care pods for people who are maybe not close to their families of origin. We
Hmm.
act as companions and advocates. And I feel like every end of life guide has their own practice and their own things that call to them. So there are some end of life guides who really focus on being bedside with people,
Hmm.
whether that looks like sitting vigil with people, providing respite care for families who are caring for people at the end of life, so that they can go off and like take some time to themselves to rest.
Hmm.
It can look like helping to create rituals and design spaces for those who are in the dying process. And some people also choose to focus more on the logistical side of things. So that could be coordinating support and helping plan funeral services or home funerals if someone's having that, or wakes. Some people like to do advanced care planning, and some people also like to help with creating legacy projects and life reviews. So I think it just really depends on who you're talking to at the moment and what their passion happens to be within this. But generally speaking, end of life guides act as supports and advocates for people at the end of life and their family units. And also I'd like to mention that we don't just work with people who are dying. Perfectly healthy people go to end of life guides as an effort to maybe talk about some anxiety that they have around death, or do
Hmm.
meditations, or
Wow.
simply to have space to hold around this idea of what death is and sort
Hmm.
of reckoning with it.
Wow, I never knew that.
Yeah.
I might be needing those services.
Yes.
Possibly.
Tap in. We're
Truly.
here.
That's great. And I know a lot of folks might be familiar with the term doula when it comes to birthing
Mhm.
and giving birth. Um, and so can you speak to why you find it just as important to give that same kind of energy towards the end of life?
Totally. I think that it's important because, as you said, we're all very familiar with birthing doulas and just like the care and support that they provide for the birthing person and their families or care units. We we all deserve that same kind of loving care and attention, and really hand holding when it comes to leaving this world the same way that we come in. And I personally feel that especially BIPOC folks and
Hmm.
queer folks, like we are absolutely deserving of that kind of care. Like the world is hard and it's hard on us in particular. So I just feel like we deserve like the utmost levels of care and being seen and being held when we're leaving the world. Everybody deserves to have at least one person who recognizes that they are leaving the world.
Hmm. And you kind of touched on how as Black folks and people of color, we've been doing this. And
Yes.
it's kind of like getting back to our roots, so to
Yes.
speak.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, which is also very healing
Hmm.
place to be. So can we talk a little bit about your online group, Black Folks Grieve, and how that
Yes.
got started?
Yes. So Black Folks Grieve started in October of 2020 after the death of my mother. And I was very much sitting in my own grief. And in sitting in my grief, I sort of, like I mentioned before, really just started like researching grief. I don't know if other people are like this, but when I'm going through something, I just find myself like reading all the things, all the books, like
Hmm.
scouring online, trying to find like spaces. Like I just really need to know what I'm dealing with. So that kind of led me to finding a lot of online spaces that were incredibly supportive, and which I am very grateful for. And alongside that, I feel like I also found myself in spaces like mixed spaces that were predominantly white that did a lot more harm than good for where I was at that moment and for my grieving process. Like
Hmm.
I found myself in spaces where I had to like explain my culture and like the slang and the way that we
Hmm.
do things, and like I just didn't want my grief to be like a teaching moment in those moments, if that makes sense. Like I just wanted to be
Yeah.
held by people that understood me. So I sat on it for a very long time, partially out of fear and those thoughts of like, what if nobody comes? Like, what am I even doing? I don't know how to do this. But then I just ultimately got to a point after the encouragement of some friends and sitting with it for a while that was like, you know what, like I need this space for me, and if I need it, then I feel like other people need it as well, so let's just start it and see what happens. And that's how Black Folks Grief came up. It is really an online space, an intimate online space specifically for people of the African diaspora, for us to come together and hold each other in our grief and talk about our losses, the people that we've lost, the things that we've lost. And a lot of the times, like the byproduct of that is that yes, we support each other, and like there are moments of joy within that that
Hmm.
we were able to find in community with each other.
Nice. Um, and so what comes up in these conversations? Just do people just share about their own experiences, or how is it like run?
So we start with some grounding. We start with some breath work at the beginning of every meetup, and from
Hmm.
there, I go through our community rules and community guidelines, and leave some space for anything that people would like to add that would make them feel safer in the space.
Hmm.
And from there, it's pretty unstructured. I do have prompts that I offer if people are just feeling kind of stuck, but for the most part, it's an unstructured conversation where people have shared about people that they've lost, people have shared about their grief, people have shared
Hmm.
about experiences that they've had while planning services, or coming up on the anniversary of someone that they love dying, or maybe somebody dying through violence and trying to find a way to reconcile like the grief of that loss, or even
Hmm.
sometimes reconciling the fact that somebody that has died has been harmful and has
Hmm.
committed acts of harm, and reconciling like how do you navigate the grief of losing someone that you may have been close to who also harmed you.
Oof, yeah.
Yeah, so we talk about a lot, and I think
Hmm.
the really nice thing about it is, or can be a nice thing, is that we're not here to fix anything.
Hmm.
We're simply here to hear each other and like honor each other in that experience. So we
Hmm.
don't people don't give advice. We literally just will sit and like let that person speak about what they need to speak about.
Yeah, that sounds really dope. I love that.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, and I feel like right now, with the many things happening around all of us or to some
Absolutely.
of us. Speaking about COVID,
Hmm.
we learned recently that in the United States, we've lost 1 million people to COVID.
Yes.
And, there's always a mass shooting,
Hmm.
seems every other day. There's
Oh,
these hate crimes, police killings, and
hmm.
you've been mentioning how you found community to be like being a community with others to be a safe space for you. Um, do you feel like with all of this, what we're calling collective grief
Hmm.
happening, that being in community with others can be helpful, and like how so?
I would say that I personally do find being in community with others in these moments of like collective and personal grief to be helpful, just because I feel like I've mentioned that grief can be and is such an isolating experience.
Mm-hmm.
There sometimes is that feeling of feeling like no one can possibly understand what you're feeling, or
Mm-hmm.
no one has ever been through this before, no one has ever had to hold this before. And being in community is just such a nice reminder that we're not alone and we're not meant to do this alone. I'm thinking of just like indigenous communities and like BIPOC communities, the fact that our culture is essentially grounded in community care, like it is communal, and that to me extends to things like grief.
Right.
We are meant to have our grief held in community with each other. And when I say community, I mean definitely like, family, friends, chosen family. And I
Mm-hmm.
also think that there's a lot to be said for how it can literally just be enough to share space with someone, like whether in person or virtually, and have
Mm-hmm.
that presence. Sometimes you don't even need to talk. Sometimes you just need to breathe the same air with somebody and
Yes.
maybe share how you're feeling, maybe not talk at all, maybe talk about anything other than what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's just many ways to show up in community: talking, not talking, being present, or just
Mm-hmm.
like tapping out completely and being like, let's talk about the latest episode of P Valley. Like, that's what my heart needs right now.
Yes. Oh my God. I can relate to the not talking, but
Yes.
being in space with someone. I recently had a number of like personal losses, and my sister and I, sometimes we just get on the phone and we literally are just doing things around the house, and we're
I
not
love
even
that.
talking to each other really.
I love
Um,
that.
yeah, and it's been kind of like one of my I guess like a coping mechanism
That's
through
real.
grief, and we've been in support of each other throughout, so it's been
Mm.
helpful. Um, so I wanted to ask you, being in grief care and end of life guide, like all of these experiences they've had to have imprinted things on you
Mhm.
also, and I'm wondering like what are some things that you've learned from these experiences with others?
I think that one of the biggest things that I've learned from being in both of these spaces is just the idea that grief isn't linear, and it's also, there's no time limit on
Oh
it.
my God, say that again, please.
There is no time limit on grief, which is something that we also talk about in Black folks grief quite a lot. This
Yeah.
idea of like, grief isn't linear, there's no time limit. So when people, it could be like 5 days or 10 years or a decade. And also, no matter how old you are, there is always going to be something that we're holding in grief.
Mm-hmm.
Grief
Mm-hmm.
stays with us and grief changes with us. So I think that knowing that grief is this thing that is going to live with me and stay with me is kind of freeing in a way, because it
Mm-hmm.
means that I'm not, there's no like, there's no time limit that I'm trying to run towards when like
Mm-hmm.
I get to this and then I'm going to be done. Like knowing that it's always going to be with me opens up that door of asking, okay, how do I live with this?
Mm-hmm.
And how do I live with it in as healthy a way as I possibly can?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that has been one of the things that I've taken, that it is something to live with and move through.
Yeah, that's a huge takeaway, truly, because a lot of times other folks or life, society, whatever,
Yes.
can make you feel like, okay, you gotta keep it moving. Forget like move on from this
Oh,
sadness or whatever.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then when we sit with that, really, it's like moving on for who and
Hmm.
why. And it's
Hmm.
usually moving on to show up in society to be quote unquote productive in some way.
Oh yeah.
Like not just knock out that grief so you can go back to like doing work and like X, Y, and Z, things which are, yes, important. And alongside that, so is like actually feeling our feelings.
Hmm.
And again, we are also very much still in a pandemic.
Yeah.
So it's also like accessing grief on that level. Like,
We're all compartmentalizing this.
oh, totally. We are compartmentalizing and like just trying to get through it. But
Yeah.
yes, I feel like that is a very big takeaway of like, there's no
Yeah.
time limit. We're all
Yeah.
still in it.
Yeah. So do you have anything you want to share about how you cope with grief personally?
Yeah, I can definitely share about the ways that I personally cope with grief.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, I feel like it honestly depends on any given day and what I'm feeling and how I'm feeling it. But for the
Mm-hmm.
most part, I really like moving my body. Like
Mm-hmm.
even something as seemingly simple as like just taking 5 seconds to like get up and move and stretch and like just feel into my body feels really good. Or
Mm-hmm.
taking a walk or like sitting outside in the sun if it's like a sunny day, like makes me feel really good.
Mm-hmm.
I also have an ancestor altar, which like very much in the beginning stages of my loss, like very much now, but very much in the beginning stages felt very comforting to me, because it was a space where, and still is, where like my mom and like my dad live. Like
Mm-hmm.
it really helped with this idea that yes, she's gone in the physical sense, but she also lives like right here and in this space. Like I can talk to her, I can like buy flowers and like give
Mm-hmm.
her the things that she still enjoyed in life and have those conversations with her. So I feel like my altar has been a really beautiful way for me to sit with and soothe my grief, because it's a reminder that as long as I still remember these people, then they're very much still alive.
Yeah, remembering them. I always wanted to do an ancestor altar, but
Mhm.
I feel like I've done like a virtual altar, so to speak,
Oh.
because I always write about my loved ones, the ones
Hmm.
who are no longer here, and I feel like that's a really great way for me to not only remember them myself,
Hmm.
but also to share that with. I have a daughter, so like the
Hmm.
younger generations, and so
Hmm.
they know them, even though they never really knew them. So
Yeah, I
it's
love that. I
good.
love that you mentioned that as well, because journaling is another thing that I definitely fall back on in moments
Mm-hmm.
of like, in life in general, but in moments of grief as well. Like I've kept a journal for a very long time. Like journaling, voice memos, just something that allows me to get those thoughts out of myself and like
Mm-hmm.
onto paper where I can like see it or not see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Just to get it out.
Exactly.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Okay. So what are some takeaways you'd like the listeners to take from this conversation?
I think a takeaway that I would have for people is what I've mentioned about grief being a lifelong experience.
Mm-hmm.
Grief is something that like stays with us and shifts with us, because as long as the person or place or thing or event that we're grieving like is not present, then the grief
Mm-hmm.
is going to be present.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no time limit. And also it's just, it can be such a slippery, messy thing that I would just really press people to try and be as gentle with themselves as possible.
Mm-hmm.
No one does this grief thing right, whether that is like, there's no right way to grieve. It's also really hard to figure out how to show up for people in like the perfect way that causes no harm and says the perfect thing. So I would just ask that people be as gentle with themselves as they can. And also remember that even deep in our moments of grief, we're still very much deserving of things like love and care and
Mm-hmm.
attention and pleasure. And also that there is nothing wrong with reaching out and finding support. And support looks like a lot of different things. For
Mm-hmm.
some people, it looks like therapies. For some people, it looks like a grief group. For some people, it looks like spending time with chosen family or reaching out to support through like hotlines or any other resources that are available. There is nothing wrong with hitting a point where you go, I don't think I can do this alone, and finding support.
Right. Yeah. I think my biggest takeaway from speaking with you today is this idea of being in community with others during your grieving times. Because, like you said, grieving can feel very isolating when you're going through it and you feel alone.
Mm-hmm.
So, if anyone listening feels alone,
Mm-hmm.
maybe you can seek out someone else and just sit on the phone.
Yeah.
And you don't have to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you can join Black Folks Grieve. Sounds
Maybe
like
you
a
can
great
join
group.
us.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a great space. And perhaps I will join once and check it out also.
Yeah, if you feel so moved too.
Yeah, totally. I think that is it for today. I want to thank you for joining and sharing all of this great information. Would you like to share anything that you're working on or ways that people can follow your work?
Yes. So at the moment, I am collaborating on an event with a tribe called Queer that is happening this weekend at 1 p.m. for us on the East Coast, which is a virtual event specifically for BIPOC LGBTQ plus people. It is a journaling event. So we will spend an hour or so getting to know each other, doing some grounding exercises, and then there will be journal prompts for people to take and write in community. And then at the end, if people feel comfortable, they can share whatever they chose to write about. So that is happening this weekend. There's also Black Folks Grieve, which is coming up June 20th, so this month. Mm-hmm. And if people want to find my corner of the world, they can find me on Instagram at The Glorious Hum or at my website, glorioushum.com.
Awesome. Thanks, Naomi.
Thank you.
What an amazing conversation. You may have noticed there was an event that has passed that was mentioned, but I'm sure if you go to Naomi's Instagram, you may be able to find information about similar events coming in the future. Now's the time in the episode where we have our mindful moment. Naomi graciously has agreed to offer us with a mindful moment. So sit back, relax, and be present.
So this mindful moment just really entails putting us in our bodies and giving ourselves space to connect to our natural breath. And then once we have that moment, I will just go ahead and share a poem with you as you sit in that space. So firstly, we will begin by just allowing the body to move in a way that feels good and most accessible. Maybe shaking the head yes or no, moving the neck, rolling the shoulders, allowing them to move away from your ears, shaking out the body. And when it feels right, allowing the eyes to close down and allowing the body to find stillness. Hands can rest on the top of the knees or over your heart space. And in this moment, just taking time to connect with your natural breath, the rise and fall of your chest, the air as it enters and exits, the sound of your heartbeat. Just connecting with self in the stillness. And from this space, I will share a poem by Della Hicks Wilson. Darling, you feel heavy, because you are too full of truth. Open your mouth more. Let the truth exist somewhere other than inside your body. And that is our mindful moment.
Thank you so much, Naomi. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you again for speaking with me today. I hope that we have a chance to do this again.
Yes, thank you again for thinking of me, and I look forward to doing it again hopefully soon.
Me too.